So hello everyone, my name is Michael Ringuette and I am the chair of the ELCORE working group in the ENIC network. I am also the head of center for the Canadian ENIC. So it's a pleasure to join you today for this seminar on information provision. To situate you, the ELCORE working group is mainly focused on trying to support the information provision of the ENIC network, of course associated with the Lisbon Recognition Convention. So this means, for example, managing the ENIC websites, but also around communication, so the social media, for example. So this session today, my presentation is a follow-up to the February 11 webinar. So we had a webinar in February that provided a bit of background on the Lisbon Recognition Convention, and more specifically on the information provision. We were also trying to define the roles of which organization was involved in providing information, as well as all the ENIC tools that would be available to support your work. So today as presentation, so I will begin the PowerPoint. Today's presentation is really focused on the information provision in terms of strategically what kind of strategy your organization could put in place to make sure that the information systems are in place, and also that you have a communication strategy that's coherent. So I will try to give you in practice what this could mean, for example, the different types of information that you're publishing, but also how you would disseminate to your audience. When we look at the role of information provision, we can see that it's quite an important aspect of recognition. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought everything in perspective for all of us that are online today. When we look at history, we can see that recognition authorities have heavily relied on the paper-based process to support the recognition of qualifications. For example, evaluators really like to examine the signatures, the stamps, the paper on which the documents are printed. So that's a good example of relying on a paper-based process that currently we all have to look at our procedures and how we're doing things to make sure that we're able to potentially adjust because of the new reality. So we all have to look at those obstacles and look at what we can do to address the situation. So of course, digitization plays a huge role in potentially helping in this front. So this is, of course, will be a topic of today's presentation, where digitization is one of the ways of trying to support the information provision. Some examples of the disruption of service for employees related to information provision, we can think about, for example, employees don't have access to their physical offices, so they're not able to look at the libraries of publications that they would have, but also look at precedents in the database, for example, if it's only available at the office. Another example is that for issuing documents at higher education institutions, it might not be possible right now because there is no access to the office, but also we can't really print those documents and mail them through the postal mail to a different organization across the world. So it really brings the emphasis on emergency protocols. What protocols do we have in place to communicate to the audience what is happening and what we're trying to do to alleviate the situation? And this can also mean using alternative methods of doing things. So when we look at the information provision, we're really looking at two big concepts. The first one is accessibility of information. Is your information accessible? The second one is it reliable? And of course, the end result we would be looking at is how can we facilitate qualification recognition as an end outcome. So when we look at accessible information, we can look at, for example, language. Is it available in the national language, but also in English or any other languages that could be used by the audience? We also think about the format. Is it video, text, images, audio, and how is that format used to maximize accessibility? We also talk about channels. So of course, a big one is online information, which, for example, would mean your website, social media, but also offline, your telephone service, if you're attending workshops or conferences. The other one is around the audience. So which audience are you targeting with your information? There's also the question of style. So is your information available in plain text that's easily accessible and readable by the audience? We often have to remember that in our community, individuals that are seeking information on your websites might not have your national language as their first language. It might be a second language, a third language, maybe a fourth language. And so this plays heavily into how we communicate and the style that we're using. The disability is also another aspect. Is your information available for people that have hearing disabilities or visual disabilities? And finally, the data protection and privacy. You, of course, will know the GDPR that plays a big role in how we manage that information according to the legislation. The other aspects is reliable information. And so here we talk about the sources of information. A primary source would be a Ministry of Education, while a secondary source might be some members of our community that are trying to assist with information provision. Is it up to date? Is this information current? Has it been updated recently? Is there a date stamp on that information? And finally, is it the question of timeliness? How quickly can I access that information? Is it available on the web that I can access anytime, 24 hours per day? Or do we have to wait to receive a confirmation either through the mail or even an email from the organization? And then, as I mentioned earlier, these two concepts, accessible and reliable information, really lead to an outcome where we're trying to facilitate qualification recognition. A good example of the types of information that is needed by assessors, qualification assessors, is the diploma supplement. So when you look at the diploma supplement, you really have a different source of information on that document. First, we have the information from the higher education institution. We also have information from the National Qualifications Framework, if there is one. And we also have information on from the Ministry of Education, for example, that describes the education system. So this is a good example of how really important and critical information is gathered on a single document that is then made available to those that are trying to recognize that qualifications. But it's important to understand, of course, that not all countries and institutions are using the diploma supplement around the world. And so how can we have other types of information that is similar to this one that can be accessible in those cases? The other example that we can provide here is the EAR HEI manual. So this manual is really a tool to support admission credential evaluators that are doing this work, but also the competent recognition authorities. It highlights, for example, how can we ensure that information is clear and accessible? It also highlights that we should provide information during the whole application process. And finally, how can we provide the information on the decision, so the outcome of the process? When we look at this process for qualification assessment, it's really a process where we have, I would say, different types of input and output. So we start with receiving documents where we're really doing the intake of the documents. We're then completing some information research and then some analysis on how this qualification would compare to our own education system. And finally, we have to communicate the results of the process. And so from this whole process, we can see that different audiences would be uh, um, giving information, providing information, and others would be receiving information. So we can think about the applicant that would need to send documents for the process to begin. We also have the institution where the student previously studied, where we would need to get information. We also have a government institution that would provide information on the education system. And then we also have our own internal information in our own organization that we would rely on to complete this process. In our previous webinar in February, we had really focused on the National Information Center. But here you can really see that there are different types of audiences that will seek information at various process and at various stages in the process. Of course, one of the big audiences will be the higher education institutions. These are the institutions that are issuing documents when students have completed a program of study, but then they would also receive documents if a student is applying to continue further studies. We also have the National Information Center. We have the employer at the end result that will try to recognize the credential. We also have different competent authorities and competent recognition bodies that would be involved in the process. We can also think in regulated professions, we have regulatory bodies that would also do assessment. And throughout all this process, we also have other interested parties, but mainly we have the individual that's seeking to study or work abroad. That individual is at the center of this whole process and is the one that would initiate the process to have the qualification assessed. In this presentation, I will really focus my attention more particularly on the higher education institutions and how their information systems are set up. One of the core principles of communication is always that there is a sender of information. A sender will send a message, and then someone will receive that message at the end of the process. And so you can imagine that this is a back and forth. Of course, we would have a sender that would send something. The receiver might then have more questions and would then recontact the sender again to get more information. So what I really want us to look at today is, does your organization efficiently send out messages to its target audiences? Are we able to really be successful in communicating the message? When we look at the channels that we use to communicate message, especially at the higher education institution, we would have both online and offline systems or channels. The online channels are, of course, an obvious one would be your website. So your organization website is really a huge tool that is available 24 hours 7 and accessible to all the audiences. We also have mobile apps that exist. We also have the social media accounts. Some organizations are now using instant messaging, for example, WhatsApp. But we also have email communication and newsletters that can be used as well online. For the offline, we have, for example, telephone systems, in-person meetings with students, word of mouth, the postal services if we need to send documents, also attending conferences and recruitment fairs, workshop and meetings. So these are all in person. We also have printed documentation that can be sent. And finally, some media outreach. So these are only some of the possible channels that would be that HEI would be using. But given the pandemic currently, we can definitively see that the reliance on online channels is critical at this time because many of the offline channels are temporarily suspended. They're not working and they might not resume for some time ahead. We can think about recruitment fairs. So this is an activity that might be postponed or suspended for some time in the near future. So how can we try to reinforce the online channels so that we really focus our attention on making sure that our information is available online whenever possible? When we look at those channels using the online channel of the web over the many decades, we can see how the situation has progressed. When we look at the 90s, when the web was initially started to be used by organization and individuals, it was a very basic Web 1.0 approach that was very limited in terms of what it could do. Then we moved gradually in the 2000 to Web 2.0, where we now had high-speed internet. It was a bit more efficient to also display rich information, rich media. So video, for example, was starting to be used a lot more. And we also started seeing business approach to using the internet, for example, to facilitate e-commerce and payment, for example, on the platforms. And now we're really moving to Web 3.0, where we're really seeing now that people are always connected, they're always on, mostly because of social media. There's always a way to communicate instantly with individual, and there's an expectation as well that we will be able to communicate and receive information quickly. It's also a more of a multi-screen universe where we have a desktop, we have mobile devices, a tablet, mobile phones, but we also have TVs, for example, where we have apps on TVs, intelligent appliances. So all these are different screens that are becoming prominent everywhere in our lives that display or communicate information. And we're seeing that the web is now being used by different units in our own organization for different applications of the work that we do. Here are some statistics on the uptake of online the online approach. So we can see, I won't read the slide, but we can see that there's an increase of use of social media. This is definitely a trend that's continuing and will probably continue to grow, where users are trying to communicate instantly using social media as an approach. But we're also seeing that there are more people that are connected to the internet or have access to internet and have access to faster internet as well, which really enables the really continued use of rich media, for example, videos. And video conferencing is a good example currently with the pandemic, and webinars that are used to try to engage online using online methods. There's also an increased use of mobile devices. So mobile phones and tablets are increasingly being used instead of more of the traditional desktop computer or laptop. That also has an impact on how we display the information and communicate the information. Again, here we have some statistics on the social media channels. You'll see here rated in order of importance of the number of active users. Facebook remains at the top of that of the number of active users, but we're also seeing changes in the I guess the uptake of the social media, and they're also based on regions. So you might have a region in the world or some countries where one platform might be more used than another one compared to another region. So that's also quite important to consider in your plan of engagement, because this will differ based on geography and language and culture. We also need to mention here that TikTok, for example, has been recently seeing a huge increase in uptake by especially youth, but also now generations that are a bit older are starting to also use TikTok. So we will have to really look at how this will progress in the coming months and years. But of course, social media keeps evolving and the trends will keep changing. So this is important to continue monitoring and also looking at statistics with the audience we're trying to engage. Now, of course, it's quite evident that we must try to update a communication channel to reach the audience, ultimately to facilitate recognition. We need to look at what we're doing and continually update it. So if we adopt something this year, it won't mean that next year it will still work and be current. And the example of TikTok is a good one. Previously, up till recently, TikTok was not a big player in the social media platforms, but it's now increasingly being one. So especially with the younger generation that will probably seek to study at higher education institutions. So will this play a role in trying to reach that audience? Many of these methods and approaches and how we do things are based, of course, on marketing and communication. So we need to look at those strategies and use those strategies to improve our information provision. We're going to see an increasing use of digital elements in the communication strategy. So these will be, of course, linked to key performance indicators, KPIs, on the different products that you're using and the services you're using. Now, there's also a need to audit your communication because you've been doing things a certain way for some times now, and now would be a good time to look at what you're doing and reassess what's happening, because you'll need to readjust based on the new technology, new ways of doing, and also the situation that's currently happening with the pandemic. So one of the first goal is to really measure how your organization is able to share and receive information. So what means do you have at your disposal to do that? You need to identify a clear scope of work. So how far will your review go in your organization? Of course, you can do a total review, but you can also review certain aspects of your communication. An example would be your website. If you've had your website for a few years now, it might be good to start reviewing what you're doing with your website and potentially planning for the launch of an updated website in the years to come. So this is a process that takes time, that needs to be planned. We also need to identify components of the communication and infrastructure, from the content creation all the way to the IT system. So you need to look at the information you want to communicate, what strategy you're going to use, and then finally, what tools or IT tools you're going to use to communicate that information. You can also look at what you've been doing. Are there successes and failures? Are there things you can learn from what you've been doing? And then start thinking about potential improvements for the future. We're starting to see new IT tools that are available to us that might help us in our strategy. Again, returning to recent trends that we're seeing with online engagement, we're seeing a lot more webinars being organized to reach the audience that previously might have been done through a meeting or a conference. So how can we reach the audience differently using online methods? If there's one thing that we've learned with the pandemic, again, it's around the emergency situations. What will happen if your systems are going down, if your website suddenly is not working, if you're not able to go physically at the office because you're not able to enter the building to be able to do your work and access your systems. There might be a temporary suspension of all operations, for example. With the current pandemic, health and sanitary situation might occur where this changes how we do things. And we can also think of a political crisis that might affect your country or your region. We can think about, for example, around refugees, where the higher education institution may no longer have access to the paper copies of the documents. So have these documents been digitized? So to make sure that we are prepared for those emergency situations, it's very important to develop a protocol. I think many organizations back in March might not have necessarily a protocol that was developed, and we all had to really turn very quickly to put in place a protocol that would enable us to continue working, given the situation. A good way of making sure that this protocol is ready is to set up a service continuity plan. So what do I do if I need to continue service, but I need to do it differently? And so this means, how can we adjust your service delivery and your operations in light of this challenge that you have? You also need to update your information systems. So for example, your website needs to be updated to make sure that it's up to date with your current situation. And finally, we need to communicate with the audience. Do we need to do outreach with all our audience that are maybe waiting for an assessment or an admission decision, and they're still in queue because we can't process the application? So there's a need to communicate to the audience to make sure they are aware of what's going on. There's also a tool that we will now discuss that I will now go over with you around the creation of what we call user persona. This is a really good strategy to help you look at all your information and try to reshape it to make sure that it reaches your audience. So these persona are fictional users that would potentially engage with your organization. Each one of your personas stands for a unique segment. So they would represent a segment of your audience, and you would have multiple personas. So not only one, but multiple that you would need to develop. For this exercise to work, you really need to use your imagination, storytelling, and rely on information that you might have from key stakeholders, but also internally. So this will be a creative process to really make sure that you understand who you're talking to. And finally, that persona, it will be quite important to develop the chronology flow that describes the journey throughout your organization. We're really talking about what will be the first interaction from the beginning of the service you'll provide to that persona, all the way to the end when the last question might be asked. So we're really looking over multiple years how one type of persona would be using or seeking information from your organization and also sending information to you. So when we look at how do we do this, how do we create these personas, we have to rely on both internal and external information. When we look at internal information, we can look at the collected data that you might have from the procedure. So you might have the number of applicants you've already assessed in your previous applications. Where do they come from? What languages do they speak? What are their ages? This can really give you a bit of a demographic view of who you're trying to serve with your services. Also look at the digital data that already exists maybe in other areas of your work. It can also rely on the research and publications that you might have done at your organization, but also interviews with those users. We can think, for example, if you do a survey after they've used your service, you might capture very interesting data on how they've used their service and how they what they viewed as a barrier and what was successful. So this could really help you understand what they need and how can you provide that information. Externally, you can look at other organizations' publication. We can also look at academic research and papers, news articles, and also reviews on other websites and feedback that might be left on other third-party websites that we don't control. We might get a bit of a sense of what's working and what's not working. So with this, we're now going to look at two worksheets. So these worksheets will be provided to you after this this session today. We have two worksheets that are specific to this process on how to create the persona and really define it within your organization. So I will now share those personas so we can have a look. Okay. So in terms of the persona, when we look at here, I've created on this worksheet. First, in terms of the goal, what are we really trying to do when we're trying to define the persona? So it's really a planning exercise that we're trying to do here, where your higher education institution will try to identify the different touch points throughout the journey of the target audience to then implement the information system that's needed to respond to that need. So we first need to identify the main target audience. So who are we speaking to and who is seeking our services? We then create the multiple user personas to understand their goals and typical profiles. We then map typical interactions with your organization from beginning to end. So here we really talk about the journey. And finally, we identify if your current process and information in your HEI are really transmitting the information efficiently. Is it working or is it not working? And what type of adjustments do you need to make it work? So for this process, I would strongly recommend you you involve different team members in your organization. So here I've taken the example of a higher education institution. So of course, we need people from the admission office that would help this process. We also need frontline service. Those are the people that will answer the inquiries, the emails, and also meet applicants when they seek to study at your institution. We also need to involve the communication department. These will be the experts that will help you refine that communication. And most importantly, we need to involve IT because IT will provide you that tool that you need for the online aspect of your strategy. So to help us refine this, I've tried to create here 4 different personas. So the first persona is Jiun. Jiun is a Korean student. He's an international student that is seeking to study abroad. And then we also have Alice. Alice is from a French higher education institution. She's an admission officer, so she's looking at the applications that are coming in for prospect students. We also have Ramesh, and Ramesh is a credential evaluator in the ENIC network. He's working for a national information center, and he will evaluate the qualifications after the student has completed the study. And finally, we also have Dan. Dan is the owner of an architect firm that would potentially employ Jiun at the end of the process when the studies are completed and Jiun is looking for employment. So in trying to really define who these people are and who these personas are, we try to attach first a goal that they would seek. And here, if we look at Jiun's goal, it states, I wish to study architecture and then work for an international architecture firm to apply my skills. So here we can already understand what the intention is at the end of the process to enable Jiun to reach his goal. We also try to define the age of that persona and what generation that persona is from, because the generation will have a huge impact on the different trends in information, consulting information, and also issuing or disseminating information. We can see here that Jiun is from Seoul, South Korea. He's able to speak Korean, English, and French, so he has 3 languages. For Alice, we can see that I wish to provide individual an opportunity to learn new skills at my higher education institution and ensure that their qualifications are recognized. Alice is 35 years old. She's a millennial. She's in Paris, France, and she speaks French, English, and Spanish. So you'll notice here that she doesn't speak Korean. So this has an impact on the information provision, of course. We also have Ramesh. So Ramesh, I wish to provide applicants with a fair qualification evaluation report based on reliable information in a timely manner. Ramesh is 44 years old, is part of the Gen X generation. He's in Toronto, Canada. His first language is Hindi. He also speaks English and French. Again, Ramesh doesn't speak Korean, so this will have an impact on the information consulting. However, he does speak French, so this would help to look at the information that will be published by the higher education institution in France. Finally, Dan, I wish to hire and retain architects who have recently completed their study to ensure my firm is competitive. Dan is 60 years old, so he's a baby boomer. He's in Melbourne, Australia, and he speaks English. So with this in mind, it really helps us understand who these persons are. And now we're really trying to continue to pinpoint very specific elements of each persona. So when we look at Jiun again in the first column, Jiun's goal is to acquire new knowledge, use the qualification in the labor market. He does have some frustrations though, because the higher education institution website has too much information to read. So it's a bit overwhelming for Jiun. We have to remember that it's also not Jiun's first language, it's his third language. And so this has an impact on him trying to consult information. Getting my student data sent to my third party is the slow process. So he's very frustrated by the process of sending his student data. So how can we try to improve that for Jiun throughout the journey? Some of the personal traits, Jiun has low attention span, but he's adaptable, which is a good personality trait, and he's always connected to the web. So this is an important aspect. He's always online. So this will define how we communicate with Jiun. So we've done the same thing with the three other persona. I will not go into detail with them. I will let you read that on the sheet afterwards. Finally, we look at the devices that they would use. So Jiun, we can see that Jiun is using his mobile device prominently. So probably his mobile phone is his first means of looking information. His second means is a tablet. So he would use a tablet to consult information. And you can see that the last device is a desktop. So the desktop is not his favorite device to use when he's consulting information. So this will have a big impact on your website as an example. You want to make sure that your website is mobile friendly and that the information is very short and brief because it's on a mobile device that has a small screen and it needs to be adaptable. Now, when we look at the channel, so what channel is Jiun using to look at information or consult information? We can see that the web is fairly low in terms of the priority channels, but we can see on the other hand that he's using a lot of mobile apps and social media to engage. Printed documentation is extremely low, so Jiun would not potentially like to receive printed documents in the mail from your institution. It might be an approach, but maybe not the favored approach. And you can see that in person is very important for Jiun. So maybe he will go in person to talk to someone at your organization, because maybe having French as his third language, it might be easier to engage in person or have that visual communication happen. So this really sums up the three personas that we've developed. These are only examples of possible personas. Of course, your organization will need to develop their own personas based on the data that you've collected. So this is only an example of what this could look like in practice for a higher education institution located in France. And then the different types of organization that would then be involved in Jiun's whole journey from the beginning of the journey studying to all the way to employment. Now we're going to look at the second worksheet that I've prepared for you. Now we're really looking at the interactions. What are the interactions from the beginning till the end of the journey? We really need to try to pinpoint what are the questions and what information are each and every one of these people are looking for. So as an example here, I've started the journey with Jiun in 2020, where it's the pre-study period. He's really looking at his goals for study and looking at potential institutions that he might be interested in. In 2021, he has applied to a higher education institution in France to continue his study. In 2022 to 24, this is the study period at the master level. So he's now studying 2 years in an institution. And finally, in 2025 to 2030, Jiun will immigrate to a different country. So here we've used Australia as an example. And he's also exploring Canada as an example as for immigration as well. And then a possible entry into the labor market to work at one of these employers. So when we look at the pre-study period, what you'll want to do in your exercise is to map for each one of these persons, Jiun, Alice, Ramesh, and Dan, what information they need and how they will try to contact you to get that information. So here we're going to use Jiun's first as an example. Jiun he's trying to find out what study program are available at your institution. So he's looking at the French institution in France to look at the different programs that are available. He's also trying to understand what is the admission policy. He's also trying to understand what step he needs to complete for the admission process. And then when I have the option of completing part of my studies at a partner institution and receive transfer credit. So he might be interested in doing an exchange with another institution, so a joint degree or a study period at another institution. When we look at the next journey in the process in 2021, so Jiun is now applying at the higher education institution in Paris, France. So he needs to find out how can I submit an application? What are the timelines to obtain your admission decision? Can I get transfer credit for previously completed the periods of study? What is the appeal process? So in case the admission is not positive, so it's rejected. In the second column, we also look at what Alice would need as an admission officer to complete the admission process. So here, Alice would need information as, for an example, what internal resources are available to evaluate Jiun's previous qualification? Do I have that information inside my organization? What was the previous HEI Jiun attended recognized in Korea? And then where can I find information on his previous program of study at the university in Korea? So these are some of the information in the journey that will be needed. Now, I didn't complete, of course, a full picture here. This is only to give you some example, but we would need to look during the study period, what typical questions would come up, what typical need of information would come up between 2022 and 2024 during the study period. And finally, I've completed here just an example, the last period, the 2025 to 2030, when Jiun is looking at immigration. So he's looking to immigrate to Canada, but he's also looking at a possible job in Australia as well. So he has two different options. So Ramesh here in Canada is looking at how can I receive Jiun student data from his higher education institution using a secure method. Can the transmission method rely on a trusted electronic delivery? So this will be quite important to look at the higher education institution in France if they are able to send the student data electronically in a quickly manner. So this is one of the questions. We also have the potential employer, Dan, in Australia. How can I confirm if Gion's qualification is authentic? So is there a way to confirm on the higher education institution in France if that credential, that qualification that he has in hand is really authentic or it's not issued from fraud? So of course, there would be additional questions that we could ask, but this really gives you a very broad overview of what this could look like. So I would recommend that within your organization, you start that process to look at how would this apply within your own organization. So let's go back to the presentation. So before we finish, I would have some few recommended readings for you that you might want to consult. Especially regarding accessibility of information. There's a really good guide that was published in 2016. You also have more guidance on how to create user personas so that we've just discussed. And of course, the GDPR is a huge factor in your information provision that you should really take in consideration when you're developing your systems. So now we're going to go to the question period. So I mainly have two questions for the audience that is participating today. The first one is, do you believe your organization information to support qualification recognition is accessible and reliable? So that's my first question to you. Given everything that you've heard just now, do you still think that it's accessible and reliable? And the second question is, what are your information strengths and weaknesses? What do you see as a strength in your systems that maybe you've applied recently, you've changed your approach recently, and it might be a best practice, but also weaknesses in terms of where you think your systems might need improvement, your communication might be improved, and how can you improve this? And here I would strongly recommend that you look at digitization as one of the means of improving your communication channels for the various regions we've mentioned today, but especially given the pandemic, this will be especially crucial on how you can communicate using digital means to improve your outreach to your audience. So with this, let's go to the question period. I would welcome your questions.